Us Homo sapiens have a tendency to categorize things. Fruits or vegetables, right or wrong, good or evil. It helps us to organize and make sense of this complex world that we live in and co-construct. We also categorize groups of people into us and them, in which the consequences of the tension between these ideologically diverse groups become the actors to the events we call history. Throughout the development of the modern world, diverse groups have become homogenized, and homogeneous groups have been split apart. This video will explore two different avenues and events in which separate people groups got homogenized through observing the case of the Ainu people. The Ainu are the recognized native people of the modern islands now claimed by Japan and Russia, of Hokkaido, Sakhalin, and the Kuril Islands. One way in which they became homogenized is through the modern study of Ainu cultures and their predecessors. Due to the lack of information and evidence, it is difficult to make a clear-cut divide among the Ainu groups. Although we know that they operated in distinct chiefdoms and tribes, the modern-day remnants of the Ainu don't operate on such basis, but are unified as the remaining descendants of the Ainu group. This leads us to the other way in which the Ainu became homogenized. It is through the conquest of the Ainu people and their land, following a war that occurred in the 17th century. I'm Hosanna, and you're watching Imagining Reality. To get a holistic grasp on who the Ainu are, we must begin at the year 16,000 before present, when a group of people from mainland Asia emigrated onto the islands of Japan. These people are classified as the Jomon, who had three possible routes to move to these islands to disperse and settle in geographically distinct areas. And then about 15,000 years later, a group of rice farmers called the Yayoi emigrated to the Japanese islands and the Korean peninsula. They intermixed with the Jomon and gave birth to the ethnic Japanese people we know of today, who I will refer to as the Wajin. Whoa, wait a second. Did we just jump 15,000 years? 15,000 years? You can't do that. Yes, I completely agree, and this brings us to a point where I can elaborate upon one way people groups become homogenized. We just don't know enough. With the amount of information available through ancient artifacts and the limits of modern technology, we are not able to make a clear-cut distinction between people groups like the Jomon. Although there are studies that hypothesize genetic or cultural variations among the Jomon, we still classify them under the same name, and we must assume the same thing for the following societies which I will introduce, including the Ainu. However, we do have more information and technological prowess to make some distinctions about the societies from the Jomon onward. Around the time the Yayoi rice farmers began mixing with the Jomon, we are able to observe two cultures distinct enough from the Jomon called the Satsumon and the Okhotsk. The Satsumon emerged on the northern part of Honshu and southern Hokkaido. They also had genetic and cultural influences from the Yayoi, but to a much lesser extent than the Wajin. Such differences can be seen as the birth of the first accounts of ideals between us and them on Japan, as the Wajin referred to the Satsumon as emishi, which kanji literally translates to shrimp barbarians. Remember these characters, as they will become very important later. On the other hand, the Okhotsk were a fishing, hunting, gatherer culture, who are seen to have lived on a wide-ranging area from Hokkaido, Sakhalin, and the Kuril Islands. Sound familiar? Yes. Today, the Okhotsk people are recognized as the greatest cultural and genetic contributor to the Ainu, and are often referred to as the Proto-Ainu group. The Ainu are seen to have taken on the Okhotsk language, rituals, diet, and sustenance practices, such as participating in a long-ranging trade from Hokkaido all the way to inland Asia along the Amur River. It is assumed and largely corroborated that the Ainu emerged from the mixing of the Okhotsk and the Satsumon throughout the coming centuries. The Ainu were fishing hunter-gatherers, just like the Okhotsk, and have even adapted the Okhotsk spiritual practices. Notable among these is their belief in the Kami, a spiritual being that manifests itself into plants, animals, fish, and even pathogens. The Ainu practice sending back ceremonies, where they'll perform different rituals to release the kami from their physical vessels and send these spirits back to their land. These ceremonies were a central part of creating the social hierarchy among various Ainu communities, from smaller bands or villages to larger complex river-based chiefdoms. These powerful chiefs dictated not only the sending back ceremonies, but also managed territorial boundaries, trade, and settled disputes among different Ainu groups. Unlike many modern-day democracies, these chiefs were recognized through a line of patrilineal kinsmen who were believed to have special connections with the kami. One of the central aspects of Ainu sustenance practices were their long-ranging trade. They are recorded to have traded with other local Ainu chiefdoms and a diverse amount of societies and people groups over a span of a few centuries. They had interactions with the Mongols, different Chinese dynasties, smaller scaled societies, and even the Russian Empire, and of course, the Wajin. Trade with the Wajin began to proliferate in the 13th century when a really strong leader named Minamoto extended his power across mainland Japan and appointed a family named Ando to develop a port city and accelerated trade with the northern groups and mainland Asia. Although trade with the Ainu grew, it wasn't until the full unification of Japan under Tokugawa Ieyasu that we see a significant development in the relationship between the Ainu and the Wajin. The war that secured Tokugawa's power was the Battle of Sekigahara in the year 1600. Even before Tokugawa claimed victory in the war, a savvy family serving the Ando headed over to Tokugawa's castle. The family's name was Kakizaki, and foreseeing the inevitable unification of Japan under Tokugawa, went to claim submission to the soon-to-come leader of the nation. They went not only to shift their loyalty, but to also possibly gain monopoly over trade with the Ainu, sidestepping the Ando family. The Tokugawa accepted the notion, but only under the condition that the Kakizaki changed its name to the Matsumae as a true sign of submission. Here, let's briefly go over some crucial information about the Wajin perspective of the Ainu and the ambiguous identity the Matsumae had. The Ainu were referred to as Ezo by the Wajin, which kanji is exactly the same as emishi. Remember that? So even after about a millennia, the Wajin still referred to these northern tribes as shrimp barbarian, clearly having no clue what they were and what their lifestyles were like. Such ignorance of the Ainu can also be seen in a map they drew of Northern Island, which they called Ezochi, or Land of the Shrimp Barbarian. I mean, look at that. The Japanese by this time had a sophisticated standard of mapping techniques, and this blob of mysterious land just goes to show how little they knew of the Ainu. This ignorance of the Northern Island is also important in the role the Matsumae played for the Tokugawa shogunates. The Matsumae weren't quite Japanese, and neither were their predecessors such as the Ando family. There are multiple accounts of both Tokugawa and Matsumae records that claim how the Matsumae aren't Japanese. The Matsumae were also excluded from the yearly obligations other clans had for bundles of rice sent to the new capital. Other studies suggest a significant Ainu or non-Yayoi influence on the Matsumae lineage that gave them such an ambiguous status. Either way, the Matsumae were not fully part of the political realm of the Tokugawa. Okay, let's go back to the trade. Now that Japan was unified and peace came about the nation, the population of Japan increased greatly, which also made demand for imports from the north greater. As the new hegemons of the trade between the Ainu and the Wajin, the Matsumae had a system called Akinaiba Chigyose, which basically prohibited all Ainu groups from trading with any other except the Matsumae. With the increasing demand for goods and this new system in place, the Matsumae looked to exploit the Ainu by shifting the trade more towards their favor. However, this system made two key misunderstandings. 1. It assumed the Ainus were already submissive and greatly depended upon the Wajin and Matsumae for various goods. 2. It idealized the Ainu as a relatively homogeneous group, just like the newly unified Japan. But this was far from the truth. As the Matsumae began to push an obviously unequal and exploitative trade, many Ainu groups just turned their back from the Wajin and traded with other groups. This misunderstanding may have emerged from the second assumption, because some Ainu groups were dependent upon the Matsumae at this point. But again, these diverse Ainu groups were autonomous not only from each other, but also from the Matsumae. However, there was a pivotal event in the late 17th century that changed this: the Shakushine's War. This war, that climaxed with the conflict between a large Ainu group unified under the chief named Shakushine and an army led by a Tokugawa magistrate, actually began with a conflict between two Ainu chiefdoms. The conflict rooted here, on the Shibuchari River, in which Shakushine's chiefdom was located by the mouth of the river. Upriver, a chiefdom led by Onibishi had contracts with Wajin miners, whose mining practices greatly disrupted the flow of salmon down by Shakushine. These two chiefdoms had a long-standing tension over hunting territories and ritual rites that extended for a couple of generations. At a certain point, the head of the mining camp, named Bunshiro, became aware of such conflict after Shakushine's group murdered one of the members of Onibishi's chiefdom. Wanting to mitigate the conflict from erupting, Bunshiro traveled to Matsumae to ask for help and also get more mining supplies. Noticing this, Shakshain became nervous and decided to attack Onibishi's chiefdom, in which he was able to kill the chief. The remaining group from Onibishi's chiefdom did their best to survive, even going to the Matsumai for help as well. However, both times the Matsumai declined. I mean, why would they help? If they thought the Ainu were already completely subjugated by them, what's the need to mitigate? Anyway, on the walk home from the Matsumai, some of the Ainu members who lost their leader caught smallpox and died. Hearing this, Shakshain developed spite for the Wajing and made them the next target for the attacks. Shakshain utilized the death of the other Ainu people and framed it as the Matsumai poisoning Ainu groups to take over their land. This rumor gained a lot of traction, banding together once distinct Ainu groups and chiefdoms under the common enemy of the Wajing. Sound familiar? Over a span of only a month, the Matsumai received reports of large Ainu bands attacking and killing the majority of merchants and samurai that entered into Ezochi. Finally, the Matsumai began to get really nervous, because they didn't have an effective army, or at least an army that could fight against the now Ainu force of 20,000. During this time, the Matsumai population largely consisted of merchants, craftsmen, and fishermen who were banned from access to weaponry under the strict feudal system. Realizing their crucial misunderstanding of the Ainu, they had to call for help from the Tokugawa shogunates. The capital agreed, as during that time the Tokugawa were getting nervous about their borders due to the emergence of a large dynasty in China. So the capital sent their own army, military commander, and even told other neighboring clans to assist in the fight with the Ainu led by Shakshain. With this new wave of military power, experience, and superior technology, the Wajin were able to defeat the Ainu group. After the war, the Matsumai, who were still permitted to rule over the Ainu on a limited basis, wrote up an extensive pledge that most of the Ainu chiefs were forced to sign on. This passage served to give off the autonomous status of the Ainu and forced them to recognize their positions as the subjects to the Matsumai and Wajin. Not only did this pledge and display of power difference subjugate the Ainu, but also homogenize them. Because by signing this, it didn't matter what chiefdom you were part of or who your patrilineal lineage leads to. If you were categorized as the Ainu, you were obliged to submit to the Wajin. The situation deteriorated greatly for the Ainu, with accounts of unbelievable levels of exploitation and abuse by the now ideologically superior Wajin, and eventually led to the colonization of their land in 1869. I made a video making a comparison of this development of the annexation of the Ainu land with the modern illegal timber trade Japan is part of. Go check it out, it's in the description box below. As we saw, the Ainu were initially homogenized by the Wajin through the development of trade and the eventual war between Shakshain and the Wajin army. Then, the Ainu were homogenized once again in the modern day, due to our lack of understanding and records of such diverse people. This becomes not only ideologically costly, but also costly in so many different dimensions for the descendants of the Ainu. Today, Japan reports that about 25,000 Ainu remain, but this is a very conservative estimate, especially if we take into account the many people who have Ainu genes in them without their knowledge. These Ainu descendants are encouraged to protect their cultural heritage, but also greatly discriminated against and still fighting till this day for their equal rights on many diverse fronts. As our world approaches many novel issues such as climate change, automation, growing inequality, and others, the way in which we categorize the human race becomes an extremely consequential dilemma we must deal with. Are we to homogenize the entire globe under one ideal such as human rights? Do you think we can unite under an abstraction such as international law while recognizing such diverse people groups? Let me know in the comments below. Thanks so much for watching my video. Just to take off a couple more minutes off of you pushing back your bedtime or procrastinating your homework, please consider supporting me on my Patreon. I'll try to make everything on YouTube and anything that I publish as free and accessible as possible, but if you have $1 or $2 to spare each month, that would help me out a lot to increase my production levels and get some more material for my research. Thank you so much, and see you next time.